morning. I've had a runny nose throughout the week, so I'll try not to sniffle straight into the microphone for you all, but bear with me as I work my way through this morning's passage. Here we are in the beginning of Advent, the very first week thereof. We are commencing our time, as we highlighted in last week's sermon, on the conquest of time by Christ and the reconciliation of the cycles of nature and of time itself back beneath the feet of Christ, that we here in the church now begin the new Christian year, or the beginning of the Christian calendar, with this first week of Advent. You will have all been given guides, our Advent guides. They are different than last year's one slightly, so there's no specific repetition that if you already had one from last year, that's all good. There's some slight differences, specifically around one or two of the readings and the hymns particularly as well. In those Advent guides, you will find practices for each of the 4 Sundays of Advent. Obviously today's the first one. You will find the primary hymn, which is sung at the end of the liturgy. This morning's one is O Come, Emmanuel, which I'll address in a moment. There will then be devotions and readings. There'll obviously be the reading for the sermon itself specifically, today's being Isaiah chapter 9, of course. And then you will have devotional readings that we encourage you to read and to meditate upon on those given Sundays, either in the afternoon or the evening or throughout the week if you would like. It's a bit of an odd one this year by virtue of the fact that Christmas Eve, the 24th, is on the Sunday, and then we go straight into Christmas Day on the Monday. Next year being the leap year, it then jumps a day extra and actually lands on Wednesday, and then we restart the kind of cycle from there. But so we have 3 actual literal weeks, but 4 Sundays specifically of Advent on this type of calendar year, which is a bit of an odd one. And so as you work your way through each week, we encourage you to partake in those things, to partake of the devotional readings that build from both Old and New Testament, looking forward to in this concept of expectancy and of hope. And you'll notice, of course, that again, thematically, we work our way through what are called the 4 virtues of Advent, or the 4 virtues of Christmas, as they're historically known: hope, faith, joy, and peace. And we examine some of the seminal texts from the Old and then New Testaments regarding these important virtues exemplified during this time of Advent and, of course, Christmas itself. Part of the celebration that we are partaking in is, as I also touched on last week, our enjoining with the historic practice of the church across now thousands and thousands of years. The Advent antiphons, as they're referred to, and those who were with us last year will hopefully remember what I'm referring to. The Advent antiphons, the 7 Advent antiphons, or the Great Advent antiphons, serve as the historic kind of source material or text for the famous modern carol, O Come, Emmanuel. And in fact, in the life of the church, with our liturgy and all of the hymns that are sung, O Come, Emmanuel, at least in terms of its source material, the modern hymn was written in the last 200 years. But the source material goes all the way back to at least around the year 500 AD. That's as far as we can tell. It may even go back further. But the celebration of Christ and his advent, his arrival or his coming, which is what that word adventus in Latin means, is something that the church has understood, and not just in an intellectual sense, but has practiced and lived out in the life of the people, individually and corporately, for thousands of years. And so we come and partake in that also. When we sing that kind of hymn, like O Come, Emmanuel, we are joining in voice with those who have come before us and those who will come after us long after we are gone. There's this sense of continuity in the life of the church. And after the sermon, I'll then specifically explain for those who are newer perhaps what those documents that you have there are all about. And so I'll explain that after the sermon itself. But here this morning, we're looking at Isaiah chapter 9, a very famous passage, certainly at this particular time of the calendar year. It speaks to something deep, it speaks to something profound, it speaks to something that is hallowed and is sacred. There is a sense of the ancient in this text, not merely by virtue of it having been penned some approximately 2,700 years ago, but even to the concepts contained in these famous words of the major prophet Isaiah. There is a sense of something far more ancient than even he himself, that he himself is enraptured and wrapped up in something that is eternal. And so as we go through, there will be connections I will draw, of course, to obviously from within the text. There will be one specific cross-reference to its fulfillment in Matthew chapter 4, where obviously the gospel author Matthew quotes this particular passage and portion. And we will also establish for ourselves something that will then come, pardon the pun, but come to light on Christmas Day itself, when we address and when we celebrate and when we honour and when we pay homage to the light of Christmas, who is the light of lights himself, Christ, the light of the world. And so there will be a number of things this morning which will then come to kind of a consummation on Christmas Day specifically. So in Isaiah chapter 9 here, let's begin in verse 1. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But later he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Now, like with any text, Old and New Testament, context is important. Context is in fact vital. And books like Isaiah, one of the major prophets, by virtue of major meaning in regards to how copious their book happens to be, their literature, Isaiah finds himself in a very pivotal point in not just the covenantal history of God's people, but indeed actually in really the history of the world. He is operating in the late 8th, early 7th century, so in other words, the late 700s, early 600s BC. He is in the heyday, and well, really actually the glory days, I suppose, of the Assyrian Empire, what we in historical terms refer to as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the New Assyrian Empire. He lives through the reign of very mighty Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, and even into the reign and the rise of the Sargonid dynasty under Sargon II, a very, very famous figure in ancient history. This empire arose and came to be the world conqueror as far as their belief and ideology was concerned, their perspective. Their emperors obtained and upheld and proclaimed a famous imperial title known by two different phrases: King of the Four Corners of the Wind, or King of the Four Corners of the World, otherwise known as King of the Universe. This was a common Mesopotamian title. The Babylonian kings had assumed this title even far before the Babylonians, ancient or new. The Akkadian and Sumerian kings had assumed this title. The Persian kings would assume this title. And we actually know of this title because our king assumes this title, King of Kings. It's specifically taken from the Persian rendering, Shahanshah. Shah meaning king, so Shahanshah, King of Kings. And this title of universal and global dominion or world dominion, universal rule over the cosmos, that many of the different Mesopotamian emperors claimed, is what Christ himself actually in fact is, and what the Bible points to him as being. During this time and during this day in which this is written, Isaiah 9, obviously earlier on in the book of Isaiah, the rise of the Assyrians is well underway. The northern kingdom, certainly portions of it, have already been conquered by the Assyrians from the north or to the north of them. And the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, up near the Sea of Galilee, have been annihilated. They have been wiped. They have been conquered. They have had their villages and cities razed to the ground, their people scorched off the earth, and the remaining minority aristocracy taken off, never to be heard from ever again. And during this time, and specifically the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 732, right around this time, roughly speaking, is the last that we ever hear of these northern tribes. And by the time the Assyrians are done with them and done with conquering basically everywhere but Jerusalem, more or less, everywhere but Judah essentially, and Benjamin, they are taken and never heard from. And that plays vitally into what we're reading here. And there's some important concepts that contextually you have to kind of get at least a basic grasp on to understand the word choice and the phraseology and the rhetoric that then Isaiah uses here. There will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he, referring to God, treated the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, with contempt. The scriptures are very clear, including through Isaiah, of course, who lives through it. The conquest on the part of Assyria of the northern kingdom was not merely an accident of history. It was not merely a poor station of victimhood on the part of those in the north. This was the judgment of God for their egregious sin, for their fall and apostasy into idolatry, into pagan practices, from sexual ritual sex, into temple prostitution, into human sacrifice, into various other things. The descent of these into darkness brought about, shock horror, darkness. They sowed chaos and they reaped chaos. They sowed evil and then they reaped it. This was the judgment of God. This was justice being enacted for those who, by this point, for about 200 years, since the division of the United Kingdom of Israel, the death of Solomon in 722 BC, for 200 years, they have been practicing evil. They have been spurning what is good. They have been abandoning everything virtuous. And then judgment came. And so it's not an arbitrary contempt that God brings down upon them. It is in fact judgment. It's justice. It's not allowing evil and darkness and chaos to just simply run wild. And he will even use a brutal enemy like the Assyrians, known for their ferocity and viciousness in battle. He is not afraid to bring them down upon even those of his own people who abandon the covenant that he made with them. Yet he says that there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. This is not a passage of eternal condemnation, of God simply flicking away the lint upon his shoulder and being done with these petty mortals. Instead, this is a passage very much in the opposite direction. It is a passage of just astonishing and mind-blowing hope, of almost incomprehensible grace and mercy, even in light of the execution of God's justice. Because he says that later on, in verse 1, he will make it glorious. He will restore its glory. Its glory has been annihilated. Its glory has been wiped off the face of the earth. Its aristocracy, the few that remained that had not been annihilated, were carried off to the northern extents and the far northern regions of the empire, and we never hear from them ever again. Their palaces, all of their national symbols, vital as those are to a people, were destroyed, were melted down, were eliminated, as if the very memory of them never even existed. Yet he will make it, the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali, representing these portions by virtue of them being the first territories that the Assyrians invaded in the north, he will make it glorious by the way of the sea, that is the Sea of Galilee, on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Here Isaiah is establishing hope. And what is that hope? The core of it, the epicenter of it, the incipit, the beginning, is in verse 2. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in the land of the shadow of death, upon them light has dawned. Those who dwell in deep darkness. Those who dwell in deep darkness. That word, other than being a broad word for darkness in general, has a much, much deeper connotation to it, in fact. It is actually the very word for darkness used back in the opening verses of Genesis 1. There was darkness upon the face of the deep. This concept of darkness is not just merely referring to a situation where there's a lack of lights on in the room, or I suppose in those days a lack of candles lit. It's referring to a place of deep existential darkness, a hole within a hole. Especially its latter rendering, the shadow of death, literally death's shadow or the shadow realm, the place of death, the shadow, the deep darkness of death. There's a whole host of ways in which you can literally and figuratively translate that word. It's speaking to something deeply profound, which in the modern era we've largely lost that sense of profundity, certainly from a metaphysical perspective, our understanding of these concepts. The concept of darkness, as we've touched on in years past, especially in relation to light, serves as the most common kind of metaphysical motif in the Old Testament. Light itself is as a concept, is hearkened to, is discussed, is exposited, is mentioned over and over and over and over again, of course, most famously beginning in Genesis 1, with those first seminal words being, "Let there be light," in the face of what? This darkness which dwelt on the face of the deep. And again, what that deep constitutes is a whole nother sermon. Probably a couple of sermons, in fact, actually. But nonetheless, this concept of ancient darkness, of ancient chaos, which, as we've covered and have covered in the beginning of last year in our series Christ or Chaos, we began, if you may recall, that I explained from those early verses of Genesis 1, this concept of what's in Hebrew referred to tohu vabohu, the emptiness and void, that God created this ancient primordial chaos and then went about ordering it. That's why Genesis 1 plays out in this very obvious structural kind of pattern of the days to days and this cycling of the days, and the exact verbiage being used in this very systematic manner in which God orders chaos, as opposed to, in the ancient Near Eastern context, the gods of the nations actually coming forth from the chaos itself, the ancient chaos. That no, this God is actually Lord over the chaos, that all created things come from him, not he coming from the created things, as has always been the belief of the pagans. And he says here, in reference primarily to Zebulun and Naphtali, but even more broadly than that, by virtue to these deep philosophical concepts that he's postulating, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. They will see it. And those who live in the land of the shadow of death, upon them light has dawned, or light will dawn, in the verbiage. There is deep cosmological darkness dwelling upon these lands of Zebulun and Naphtali. Their portion in human history, as far as any observer in Isaiah's day was concerned, is over. Their people are done. As I mentioned, the minority aristocracy has been taken off and quasi-exiled, I suppose, into the far northern extents of the Assyrian Empire, and their record we do not hear of ever again. And we find this scenario that in this day there is a dread and a terror, not merely just for the might of Assyria, but more importantly for what they have demonstrated that they will do. That there's no length to which they will not go, that this great power from the north, from the Israelites' geographical perspective, is conquering the world and is bringing it to heel, and the power of their darkness is unstoppable. That is the perspective of any Israelite living in the late 8th century during Isaiah's time, I can assure you. That there is this abiding evil in the world that we cannot overcome. The darkness doesn't just merely refer to those basic kind of surface level concepts. It refers to even the very nature and the course of history itself. In darkness they see no speck of light. in the face of this great evil conquering their world, it appears, and understandably so, that darkness and evil and chaos will not be able to be stopped. And it's from that immediate kind of context that we then see how this translates into the broader scope of history. Because upon that basis, those Israelites in the late 8th century BC could have easily been forgiven for thinking that they were about to be carried off into slavery like they were in Egypt for hundreds of years. Except this enemy was far bigger and more terrifying. This enemy of Assyria would actually go on to conquer Egypt. The nation who was the eternal enemy of the Israelites would be brought to its knees by these Assyrians. But even in the midst of this great, not merely national chaos and darkness, but indeed this world dark, this cosmological sense of darkness, that in the universe there is no good anymore, there's no light, that hope has been sucked out of everything. Here, the very creator of that cosmos is, through the utmost confidence, explaining and expounding how the light will absolutely conquer that darkness. And that despite the apparent or seeming hopelessness, worry not, nor fear, because hope is still present and hope is coming. He continues in an exhortation to their context. You shall multiply the nation. You shall make great their gladness. They will be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of the harvest, as men rejoice with when they divide the spoil. There will come a day of peace and abundancy and of blessing that will return. For you shall shatter the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders. The burden of living through darkness, the burden of living through in the midst of evil all around you, the oppressive nature of it, the slavery to sin and to darkness. It will be shattered and it will be broken. The rod of their taskmaster, their slave master, as at the battle of Midian, referring to the great losses and then victories on the part of Gideon, particularly in the book of Judges. For every boot of the booted warrior in the rumbling of battle, and the cloak rolled in blood will be burning fuel for the fire. Fire, in this concept of fire, of course, associated not merely with heat as opposed to cold, but particularly with light as opposed to darkness. As we establish and set up our Advent wreath that mark each of the weeks of Advent, the 4 red candles symbolizing the 4 weeks, or the 4 Sundays specifically of Advent, and then the white candle in the middle, the one we refer to as the Christ candle, that we then light on Christmas Day. This symbol of fire is intimately and intricately related throughout human history to the concept, of course, of light. Apart from being a source of heat and of light, it also then by extension is a source of life. When lost in the wilderness, when camping, when going on an expedition through places that are cold and so on and so forth, the campfire is one of the most fundamental things that humans have done and have built, because it's the source of not merely heat, which keeps you alive, which keeps you warm, which allows you to see and hopefully see out enough beyond the campfire for any potential predators out there in the darkness. Again, this kind of concept of darkness playing in. It is also a source of life. It keeps you living, and itself almost has this air of sentience. I say that colloquially. It has this sense of being alive, the flickering of the light, its own movements in the breeze. These are not trite or trivial things. These are actually vitally important to our understanding of the world in which we live, and light itself will be specifically touched on, as I mentioned in the introduction, on Christmas Day. But he's giving them this hope. And how then shall verse 2 be fulfilled? How then shall this great light dawn upon the realm of the shadow of death, upon the realm of deep cosmological and existential darkness? How then shall that be fulfilled? This is where we then get this most famous portion in verses 6 and 7 specifically. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. Now, many times, at least in my experience, and I say this humbly, the play on words here gets a bit lost in translation. Not literally, because the translation's very straightforward from Hebrew to English, but lost in translation as far as our understanding is often concerned. Not seeing the importance of the word play going on here. This is a classic form of Hebrew parallelism, just like in verse 2, the same concept repeated twice with slightly, usually deeper wording used. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. This is one of the most mysterious passages, or even in this case just sentences, in really the entire Old Testament. One of. Not in a mystical sense or an obscure occultic sense in the sense that we ourselves cannot understand it. No, we very much can. Thankfully, by virtue of the New Testament, where this is revealed and this mystery of what that means, of how a child is born and a son given comes to life, or comes to being, comes to fruition. For unto us a child is born, hearkens to and speaks to the mortal nature of this great Saviour, the human nature of this Saviour. A child, human, being born through natural birth. This is not, as the Greco-Romans would refer to in their later culture, a phenomenon of deus ex machina, which is the god of the machine. In ancient Greek theatre particularly, you would have either a tragedy or a comedy going on, so theatre production, and things would be going horribly wrong, and then all of a sudden the actor dressed up as Athena or Zeus or Dionysios would come swooping in on a cable across the top of the theatre on a machine. Deus, God, ex machina, of the machine or from the machine, and would save the day. Everything would be going completely horribly wrong down on stage, in the play, in the theatre, but don't worry, all of a sudden, zimzalabim, a God will swoop in and fix it all. And very conveniently end the plot however the authors happen to want to end it. The celebration that we partake in of the Advent, or the Adventus, the arrival of Christ, is not, in fact, it's actually the antithesis, it's the opposite of Deus ex machina, of things going horribly wrong, and then all of a sudden God coming riding in on the spur of the moment and just fixing everything. Keeping in mind here that we are nearly 3/4 of a millennium before the incarnation of Christ, before the incarnation of the Son of God. There is this long expectancy playing out over the course of centuries, and even as we obviously go further back, because it's not the first time that the Messiah has been spoken of, the Saviour. This is just one of the more famous ones. He has been spoken of already by this point in the late 8th century BC for thousands of years. But unto us a child is born. He is human. And this is to be expected. Man has an incredible proclivity and tendency to look for mortal heroes. And in fact, often God does raise up mortal heroes. He raises up men who lead a people in battle. He raises up a good and just and great king to protect the realm, to defend the people from foreign foe, and so on and so forth. God raises up people as heroes, and that's fine. We look to many of those heroes, of course, in the scriptures. We look to heroes of the faith, like Moses, like David, like Isaiah, so on and so forth. But yet there is this other concept that is directly and intimately attached. Unto us a son is given. Now again, this has to be understood in the context in which it's being written. A child being born and a son being given presumes something. It presumes something quite deep, philosophically and theologically. It presumes something that is different. It presumes something that is unique. Namely, that in this child being born and the very birth of that child, it is at the exact same time a son being given. And yet that naturally presumes, for starters, that this one who is born is already a son of someone, and that he's being given through that birth. Do you understand what I'm drawing to? Yeah. It presumes relationship, namely that this son has a father. It presumes an authority, that this one to whom he relates, in this case a father, is able to give him prior to and even through his birth in the world. It presumes his pre-existence, namely his eternality. It presumes his status. It presumes that he himself already has a particular ontological nature that imbibes within it authority inherent thereunto. And that through this child being born, a son is given. And given to whom? Given to us. Given to, firstly, his people, ancient and modern. Given to us, his people. Given to all of those who are in Christ, from Adam all the way down to our day. And then also by extension unto the world that he made, unto mankind on the whole, unto the very cosmos that he is now stepping into by virtue of his being born as a child. That there is this act of giving, that when we think of the gift, and really gifts, plural, that God gives in, through and by his grace, every single one of those must be understood as being referential to the central and highest gift of God, namely himself, namely the Christ, namely this Jesus. He is the gift of God. And every gift that we are undeservedly blessed with comes in, through, and by him. He is the very epicenter and core of our religion. He is its very summit and apex. He is in all and through all that we do. We do not merely have a religion of academic or intellectual postulations. We are not merely a religion in principle only, where one makes a codified list of intellectual assents that they give a nod or a tip of the cap to in their head. Instead, our religion is built around, in opposition to, quite frankly, every religious or philosophical system, it is built around one thing above all: allegiance unto and communion with a personhood, unto a son that was given as a child who was born. This one who is having the government rest upon his shoulders, the weight of rulership, of governance, of imperium being upon his broad and capable shoulders. This one who is referred to by attributive titles, replete and endless, In this tiny microcosmic example here in Isaiah, he's referred to as wonderful. He is referred to as the one who is awe, who is awesome, not in the kind of trivial sense, the casual sense which we usually use that word about something. Oh, that's awesome, yeah. Awesome in its historic English sense of drawing out awe from the subject that beholds it. Likewise, its related term awful, we think of obviously we have it in a common parlance, something being awful, something being bad, and that's fine. But again, the etymology hints to what that word means, the awful, the one who is full of awe, the one who inspires awe and dread, the one who causes all mortal flesh to keep silence and with fear and trembling stand. He is wonderful. He is the source of all wonder. He's the source, therefore, of all beauty, all goodness, all truth, the transcendental values as we refer to them in philosophy. He is the source of these things because he is these things. He inspires wonder and awe to the human soul that rightly and rightfully beholds him. He is the counselor. He is wisdom. He is the wellspring and the fountain of wisdom and knowledge and truth. He is the one who advises and gives counsel to all those who are wise enough to listen and to hear, to hearken their ear unto wisdom that is infinitely beyond their comprehension, that listens and heeds the words of the one who is from eternity unto eternity, the one who was and who is to come, the one who is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all things, the one who at this very moment stands at the first day of creation and at the day of judgment and at our own day at the exact same time. Because to him there is no time. Because he is beyond it. Because he is above it. He is, as the medievals refer to it, supra et ultra, above and beyond. And he is the very creator of time itself. And that is why the very next title, the very next attributive title that is referred to, Mighty God and Eternal Father and Prince of Peace. In connection to that concept of time, I'll address Eternal Father. A more direct translation of this would be Father of Eternity. It's a noun for starters. There's no adjectival component. The Father of Eternity. The Father of time itself. The one who is eternity. The one who also holds eternity in his hand. The one who is beyond time because time is a creation of his own machination. The very concept of time itself was conjured and came forth from his intelligible mind. His own mind is the very fountain of time itself. That when we consider him and behold him, when we ponder who God is, we are dealing with something beyond our own finite capabilities. We, in a cosmos bound by time, we ourselves bound by time, we are born, we live and we die. Our days are numbered by this God who knows all things because he has planned and predetermined and set all things in motion. He stands as the Father, the Creator, the progenitor of eternity itself. He is the one who is referred to as El Gibor, the mighty God. This concept of Gibor, a warrior, the one who is a champion of his people, the one who goes forth and conquers, the one who triumphs in battle. He is mighty, he is renowned, he is feared. There are many ancient warriors in the Old Testament, both among the Israelites as well as particularly from without the Israelites, who are referred to using that title of Gibor, as a mighty warrior, as a champion. On the day of battle, David stood in that station or that office, so it were, in his battle against Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. And these two Gibors went to battle. These two mighty men, these two warriors went forth. God here is referred to as El, meaning God, El Gibor, the mighty God, the warrior God. The one who fights for the right, who fights for justice, who fights for light and for goodness and for truth. The one who does not merely hide his light beneath a bushel, hide it behind the veil, but instead shines forth his light through the bushel, vis-a-vis, of course, its most famous iteration in Exodus chapter 3, when God appears unto Moses in the burning bush. This is why then Christ gives the exhortation that we, God's people, the church of God, are to be the light of the world, as we had always been through the Old Testament, as we are continuing to be throughout the New. And that we're not to hide our light beneath a bushel or behind it, using ancient metaphor. Because in contrast to that, God shone through and in the bushel. This is what he was drawing mind to. This is what this warrior does. This is what this God does. He does not run at the sight of trouble. He does not hide from challenge of chaos and of darkness. Instead, he knows, because he is light, that light overcomes the darkness, and that no darkness can dwell in him at all, for he is light. This is what the Apostle John says in his epistles. We then, being bearers of that same light, are also to be mighty in war, though the weapons of our warfare are not carnal or material in that sense. They're not sword and shield. They are spirit and water. They are word here. They are bread and wine there. That our voices serve as the instruments of our warfare. That when we sing, when we congregate together in this holy place, where heaven and earth are united, our voices are the instruments of war. That we are proclaiming out into the world, that we're proclaiming into the cosmos the glories of this God, his might and his power and his wonder and his wisdom and his eternality. That we're proclaiming that audibly and visibly in unison with each other, where one voice among the family becomes part of the one voice. This is why when we understand rightfully what we are partaking in here in these important festive seasons throughout the liturgical calendar, like I referred to last week, that our voice is not merely confined to the select people that happen to be in this specific congregational church, that we are actually joining in a genuine metaphysical sense with all those around the world who are doing the exact same thing now, as well as doing that in unison with all those who have come before, who have done the exact same thing, whose belief and custom and traditions we're now inheritors of, that we're now guardians and custodians of, with the knowledge that as we join with those over the last 2,000 years, we also hold and uphold the faith that we proclaim, for example, in the creedal confessions, that we are joined with those over the next 2,000 years, that we're joined with all those who will come after us, with our grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, that this one whom we worship is also the Prince of Peace. Now, peace we will address, of course, in the fourth Sunday, when we talk about the peace of Advent and that virtue. Him being referred to as the Prince of Peace harkens to this concept of rulership, of governance being upon his shoulders, of him bearing that responsibility, of that authority, and of everything that comes with that. He is the Prince, he is the ruler of peace. That peace comes not through vain mortal means, but rather through divine truth. That it comes through man being reconciled unto this Prince of Peace, and thereby as a result of reconciling the nations unto himself, as through the Great Commission we are told to do, that he will then reconcile consequently those peoples. Because by being reconciled with God, they are now able to be reconciled with each other. There can never be peace between those who are not reconciled themselves unto God. They can come up with accord, they can make treaty, they can bring in ceasefire. There will not be peace between those, an abiding peace, a lasting peace. More importantly, a genuine peace, ontologically and teleologically genuine, that is to say with regards to its nature and purpose. A genuine peace between those who are not themselves reconciled to God. That peace will crumble, that peace will fail. There is a reason why a place of warfare like Europe, historically speaking over the course of thousands of years, found itself over the course of the last 2,000 years to arrive at an unprecedented, literally unprecedented level of peace. Because by the grace and providence of God, for whatever particular reason of his choosing, Europe was the first continent to become Christian in that sense, to come under the banner of Christendom, the kingdom of God. And now peoples that had been enemies since ancient times now were actually united by one common factor, their allegiance to Christ and to his servitude. This Prince of Peace brings peace through his conquest of the human heart. And that is why then the prophet Isaiah says in verse 7, there will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. There is this concept attached and really inherent to this passage of it not just being Deus ex machina like I referred to earlier, of it being kind of plonked on the world all of a sudden. There is this sense of it growing, of it being nurtured, of it being of it flourishing, that there will be an increase and a growth. This is why Christ himself gives all these various parables along those lines in reference to the kingdom. That it being like a mustard seed, a very tiny little seed, it grows up into a great tree. That it blossoms and grows, that it being like a rock that smashes the idols of man, like in the days of King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. It then grows, that rock, which starts small, grows into a great mountain that fills all the earth, that all the nations will ascend up to drink from the living water that flows down in streams from its apex. All of these various kind of concepts which flow from the Old Testament into particularly the Gospels and into the New Testament, of the coastlands awaiting his law, of this sense of expectancy that comes with awaiting the increase of his government, which has been going forth now, even unto our day. That upon the throne of David, the messianic throne, the cosmic throne, the universal throne, and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. He establishes it, he founds it, in other words, and he maintains it. He keeps it, he upholds it. His reign, unlike the kings of earth, does not have an end. His reign is eternal. The increase of his government, a perpetual increase, all the way up until, like we saw last week, that final enemy of death is defeated upon his return. And then he steps forth into the fullness of this kingdom which he had by that point now been bringing about. The zeal, the passion of Yahweh of hosts, the Lord of hosts, the God of war, will accomplish this. The, again, phraseology of will. It is not may, it is not hopefully, it is not perhaps. The passion of the God of the heavenly armies will accomplish this. He will accomplish all that he has said, particularly and specifically from verses 1 through to 7. That his commitment, his will, eternal and divine and omniscient, will definitively accomplish this. To round up, if you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 4, this is where it is quoted unto us, this particular passage, in fulfillment, that we find therefrom these words that come to us through the gospel, that therein Christ fulfilled these words. Matthew chapter 4 is towards the beginning of Christ's ministry, of course. And then we find therein these words from verses 12 onward of Matthew chapter 4. Now when Jesus heard that John, that is to say John the Baptist, had been taken into custody, he departed into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and lived in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, the very regions which Isaiah chapter 9 speaks of, up there near the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth itself, obviously the hometown of Christ. He was born in Bethlehem to fulfill those respective prophecies of being descended through the Davidic royal line. Being raised, though, and living in Nazareth up in Galilee. Nazareth itself more or less being on the borderland between Zebulun and Naphtali, Shokhar. He then begins his ministry there. He begins his ministry in the land of the shadow of death. He begins his ministry in the land which had been annihilated nearly 3/4 of a millennium prior, and which had remained under the consistent conquest of empire after empire after empire since. Up there by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, in order that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet would be fulfilled, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who were sitting in darkness saw a great light, and those who were sitting in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has dawned. Now he's quoting, he being Matthew, St. Matthew, is quoting the Greek version, and fascinatingly enough, there is a slight variance. Hebrew is interesting when it comes to tenses. It doesn't really particularly have a tense per se. It does, but it's complex. Greek has very clear tenses, and in fact has even more than English, generally speaking, or at least as many. We can figure out exactly when it's referring to something in the past, something in the present, something in the future, something continuing from the past into the present, so on and so forth. And the Greek version gives this incredible twist on the wording or on the phraseology. The people who were sitting in darkness saw a great light. And those who were sitting in the land of darkness and the shadow of death, upon them a light has dawned. The most straightforward rendering of the Hebrew which we read earlier is the light will dawn. That upon them a great light will shine. Here now Matthew is saying, through his quotation of the Greek, upon them who were sitting in darkness, they saw a great light. There is this sense of fulfillment. Those who are sitting in the land of the shadow of death, upon them light has now dawned. Verse 17, from that time forward, Jesus began to preach and say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven has come. The kingdom of heaven has arrived. All these terms synonymous in the Greek. The kingdom of heaven has come. He is the one who brings it. He is the one who now, from our perspective, brought it. And the call to repent, for this kingdom of heaven is at hand and has come and has arrived. It's now within our grasp. It's now here, is his saying. Here Matthew points to as being fulfilled in his day. And so part of this traversing of history that we partake of is us looking all the way back to things like Isaiah 9, looking at the hope, the fundamental hope of the adventus, of the arrival of Christ and of his kingdom, and seeing the sense of longing, the sense of expectancy of God's people through the Old Covenant, through the Old Testament, of seeing the impending and seeming hopelessness of the great darkness that dwelt literally all around them. And not just merely around them in some external sense, dwelt in their very midst, dwelt on their very corners as those who had abandoned the covenant allowed and opened the door for darkness and for evil to creep into their own neighborhoods, their own villages, their own cities. And those who were faithful to the covenant, as opposed to those who broke their oaths. If our own brothers and sisters, our own fathers and mothers, our own children, if they can't even keep their vow, uphold their oaths, if they can't even remain true to righteousness and to God, then what hope is there for all those who have been drenched in cultural darkness for thousands of years? Well, indeed, then, this is the true hope. Because notice that in Isaiah 9, the hope for, in that specific referential sense, Zebulun and Naphtali, by extension the world, right, being the borderlands with the Gentiles, with the nations, with Assyria, that the hope proclaimed in Isaiah 9, praise be to God, has absolutely nothing to do with anybody in Zebulun or Naphtali. It has nothing to do with the might, the will, the energy of anyone on this world. Instead, who is the hope centered around? The wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the Father of eternity, the Prince of Peace, upon whom universal governance, universal dominion, world imperium, this cosmic rule is placed, and he carries that faithfully upon his shoulders. And that the light dawning upon the world, again, we'll address that more by the time we get to the end, by the time we get to Christmas Day. But that hope is not upon the shoulders of merely mortal flesh, but is upon the shoulders of one who is divine, is upon the shoulders of one who is the hope of Advent, upon the one who is the object of our faith, the one in whom we rejoice, the one who is, as the text says, the Prince of Peace, and the one who is the very light that has now dawned upon the world. And the rising of this Sun of Righteousness has been growing as it ascends through the sky, as it traverses the cosmos, as it fills the world with with light that drives out the darkness, that drives out any shadow of death that might prevail. That where there is light, there cannot be darkness. And in God, who is light, there is no darkness. This is the hope that we hold joining with those who held this hope looking forward, we now have the blessed assurance, as the hymn would say, of looking back, seeing the fulfillment of that hope, and then knowing with confidence, confide in Latin, with faith, that everything else wrapped up in the first coming of Christ will most assuredly, in equal and commensurate measure, be achieved in his second coming. That this resurrection that we are promised, that life does not merely end at the gates of death, that this Father of eternity is able to also bring us into that very same eternity. That is the hope that we too hold. And so we look back upon his first advent and draw the source of our hope with regards to his second advent as we begin this cycle again upon the time and the life and the work of Christ, who is the hope of Advent. Amen.